I want to talk about Israel's energy situation today. I was here 12 or 13 months ago, and I gave a talk then about Israel's energy situation. For those of you who were there and might think I'm going to give the same talk today, the answer is I would like to give the same talk, but in fact I can't give the same talk because things have changed. And this is a consequence of what has happened in Israel. The gas is still there. There's still a potential for more gas. The problem is that they've got themselves into a tremendous political muddle. And I will talk about that muddle today. I will also talk about the regional context and the hope for the future. The standard case, of course, is that Israel is the one part of the Middle East where there isn't huge amounts of oil and gas. That is, of course, no longer true. They have discovered natural gas offshore in the eastern Mediterranean, and it is enough natural gas to make Israel essentially energy independent. Energy independent is a curious phrase, and how you define it depends on who you are, your technical knowledge, and probably where you are on the political spectrum. But it essentially means that Israel's got enough to no longer worry about energy. It doesn't mean to say it doesn't rely on some energy imports, but the overall picture is that it's got enough natural gas for its own domestic use and surplus to export, and with the money from that exports it can then pay for the oil that it hasn't got, and perhaps a little bit of coal as well. Unlike yesterday when nobody used visual aids. Today, I am going to use visual aids. I say that outrageously because at this point, usually technical difficulties intervene and I can't use visual aids, but I've coped with that situation as well. This is because I'm not sure on the academic rule of visual aids. I suspect it's something elevated, like if you use visual aids, you're not a proper academic. Well, I am not a proper academic, I'm a journalist. I'm privileged to be invited here today, but I don't kid myself that I'm a professor, an assistant professor, or whatever. And so what I wanted to start off by is actually drawing a little map of the Eastern Mediterranean. And this isn't particularly challenging because I suspect it's a map that you're already familiar with. Not that you, perhaps some of you have, but I doubt whether many of you have thought about energy in the Eastern Mediterranean, but you've thought about it in biblical terms. And you've probably, as a child, had to draw maps of Israel and Egypt in order to do your homework. So, with a bit of luck, if I walk over here, I am going to draw you a small map of the Eastern Mediterranean. So you have this in your mind. And the basic feature of the Eastern Mediterranean is that I'll get out of the way in a moment, but the coast comes down like this, and there's a notch, and then it sweeps down like that, and then over there. Right, now the notch is Haifa, and Tel Aviv is about there, but in biblical terms Tel Aviv didn't exist. This is Sinai, and over here is the Nile Delta. The River Nile, one of the great rivers of the world, ends up in a delta there. And the Sea of Galilee is roughly on the same latitude as Haifa, so that is there. and the Dead Sea is somewhere down there, which used to be bigger than what it is, but it's something like that. And this is the River Jordan, and this, where the River Jordan is the Jordan Valley, which is part of the Rift Valley, which also extends into Africa. And as you will recall, almost certainly, this is in fact below sea level. It's also I was going to say incredibly hot, but I hesitate to say incredibly hot in Tucson, Arizona, because you know what hot is. Except here it is dry heat, there it is terribly humid and uncomfortable. Anyway, so I want you to have this, there's one other feature of this which you don't normally have on those biblical sketches you may have once drawn, and that is the island of Cyprus, which is, roughly speaking, up there, and Turkey is way up there, so this is Cyprus. Okay, right, so that's, you can all draw that yourselves. You know that one's a very familiar one. So let me take you into the situation today. And I don't have a huge PowerPoint, but I have a little PowerPoint. And so, right, that's me. And this I've taken off the website of a company called Noble Energy, which is a Houston-based company which has been the principal company which has found oil and gas, or rather gas, in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's been working with Israeli partners, and there you can see Haifa, Tel Aviv, and the island of Cyprus. The Noble Energy is very good at what it does. And lots of people have looked for natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. Noble Energy is the only one which has found it in commercial quantities. And we're talking about what to me seems technically on the verge of impossible, but engineers assure me it's just an interesting challenge. But if you are, Israel's current producing field is the Tamar field, which is the orange one here in the center. And this is, the Tamar field is about 65 miles out to sea from Haifa. It's in water 6,000 feet deep, and the natural gas field is 6,000 to 8,000 feet below the seabed. So when you look for this gas and you actually find this gas, you are on a platform which is floating in the ocean, temporarily tethered to the bottom, and drilling down through the sea, through, well, it doesn't have to drill through the sea, but that's part of the process, but it's 12 to 14,000 feet down. And they found gas down there. They've also found it in these other places as well. The yellow dots indicate places where gas has already also been found, but the big fields here are the Tamar field, the orange square, which is currently producing. Leviathan is also an even bigger field, and what is marked as Cyprus is in fact a field called the Aphrodite field. It belongs to Cyprus, but has yet to be exploited. Karish, Dalit, Tanin, Tamar Southwest and Dolphin are smaller fields, and by themselves they may not be commercially viable to exploit. But the fact that they are close to the Tamar field means that the pipe work you need to do to get that gas ashore isn't so complicated. You can just join it into the pipe work that you have already. Now, I say pipe work, there's a danger that when I show you the next slide, you will think this is beginning to get complicated. And there you are. It starts to get complicated. I've got a few copies of this, which I'm quite willing to give away to people later, but I will sketch out some of the complicated aspects of this. For a start, the simple aspect of this is Tamar is here, and the gas from Tamar comes ashore in this pipeline here, and then to the Israeli coast here at Ashdod, and where now offshore Ashdod there is a platform. Essentially the pipe work has been, if you went out to sea in a boat to the Tamar field here, you wouldn't see anything other than ocean. But they have built, at considerable cost and to great engineering skill, a collection apparatus on the seabed, and the gas is fed up from 6,000, 8,000 feet below that into the collection apparatus, and then there's a pipe along the seabed which goes to here, and here there is a platform called simply enough, the Tamar platform, where some of the initial processing takes place for the gas. The gas is, to put it crudely, wet and dirty and full of sand, and you need to get rid of that sort of stuff before you feed it into the network. So that some of the processing takes place there. At Ashdod, there's a place called, simply enough, the Ashdod operating terminal, and that's where some of the gas is processed yet again, and then it is fed into the Israeli pipe network, which runs north and south, and as well as into the Jezreel Valley and down to Beersheba. And it's going, the gas is going not only to Israeli power stations, the power stations which produce the electricity for ordinary Israelis, but it's also going to smaller power stations associated with particular industrial plants. So that there are a different set of customers. With natural gas, it makes sense. You don't need a huge power station, a series of huge power stations. You can have big ones and smaller ones. In terms of Israel's electricity, the figure will eventually be between 80 to 90% of Israel's electricity will be from natural gas. Currently, it's the figure is about 60%. This is an enormous change. When there was a time when, not so long ago, 20 years ago, that Israel produced its electricity by burning fuel oil, which is dirty and expensive, and coal, which might not be so expensive, but is still very dirty. This, of course, it's not very sensible to become 100% reliant on natural gas. You need another option just in case there's a problem with your natural gas, particularly because the gas currently comes ashore just via one pipeline. And so there'll be one of the Israeli power stations is planned that it will continue to use coal. This is a sensible way forward. Now, in regional terms, this gives some of the spaghetti here indicates the possibilities which are out there. Now, Tamar, for the moment, only brings gas to Israel. There is a plan to expand the production of the Tamar field, and that will give Israel an option to send the gas to some of the other regional states. Indeed, the first customer there are two small Jordanian power plants down here on the Jordan side of the Jordan Valley, just below the Dead Sea. There's a bromine plant down there and a potash plant down there, and those are going to be have their power generated by Israeli gas from, I believe, the end of next year. There's already the plans to build a pipeline across the border. The route has already been chosen. They haven't yet, diplomatically it's been agreed. They haven't actually started doing the connection yet. But there are other possibilities as well. And the most interesting possibility is the gas which come from the Leviathan field, which is 3 times the size of the Tamar field, and which is essentially the field which Israel will use partly for domestic purposes, but will give it export potential as well. At this point, I have to digress into a little bit of technical description. But essentially, there are 2 ways of exporting gas. You either put it in a pipeline and send it to your customer, or you liquefy it and make it what is known as liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and that enables you to put it on a ship, and your customer becomes the country wherever the ship ends up. Now, as always in these things, these options don't come cheap. Now, the pipeline option is the cheapest option, but it doesn't work for distances more than a couple of thousand miles. So Israel needs to think in terms of LNG as well. The trouble with LNG is that in order to build an LNG plant, it's going to cost you $5 to $10 billion, and it's a huge industrial plant, and nobody in Israel wants to be a neighbor to a huge industrial plant. They don't want to be neighbors to the huge industrial plants they already have. The idea of building yet another one is infuriating politically. As I mentioned in my presentation last year, as part of my researching on natural gas and becoming familiar with the topic, I was in the Gulf state of Qatar, which has the 3rd largest gas reserves in the world, although it is otherwise an almost irrelevant country, and is currently the largest exporter of LNG in the world. And I said to a friend in Qatar, "Can I go and see your LNG facility?" And he was a good friend and a well-connected friend, and so he organized it. And I was driven up there one morning, and their LNG facility is spread out over an area of about 12 by 40 miles, including a gigantic port as well. Now, Qatar has an awful lot of gas and multiples of the amount that Israel has, but you can't do LNG facilities on a small scale. So the trick for Israel is the gas which is used domestically, that's a big tick. If they can also send some by pipeline to neighbors like Jordan, that's another good tick. Jordan, though, is a small country and not a sufficiently big customer to be anything more than an add-on to the project rather than the main part of the project. And so Israel has been looking for other options. Now, after Mubarak was overthrown in Egypt, there was, for a year or so, a couple of years, a Muslim Brotherhood government led by Mohammed Morsi. Mubarak had a cold peace with Israel. Mohammed Morsi despised Israel, and so that wasn't a good way forward. General Sisi, now President Sisi, who pushed Morsi to one side, is a different person on this. He's still a dictator, so there's a sort of hold your nose attitude as you deal with him. But he doesn't have the hang-ups about Israeli gas. And he's well aware that Mubarak's hold on power was weakened, and indeed Morsi's hold on power was weakened because of energy shortages in Egypt itself. So the lights went out, the air conditioning went off, and things like this. This is, dictatorships work best when they have, it's a police state and the people are relatively happy. If you're not relatively happy if your power keeps on going out. And so Sisi's simple recipe for staying in power includes keeping the electricity on. And so to do this, he is quite prepared to buy gas from Israel, and indeed that's where some of the talks are going at the moment for Israel to send gas to Egypt for use domestically in Egypt. Egypt also has a couple of LNG plants which have already been built, and because of the huge demand for gas in Egypt, the amount which has actually been exported from Egypt has declined almost to zero. And so these LNG plants are potentially of use for Israeli gas as well. Now, if I can show you some of these things, Leviathan, as I said, is here. This blue dashed line here, dashed means it's somebody's dream rather than a reality. Goes to this place here, which doesn't have a name but is in fact called Idku, where there's an LNG plant, and that's a prospect for using Israeli gas. Send it to an Egyptian LNG plant and it can be exported from there. There's also the idea that some of the gas can come ashore and then go in a pipeline which runs across Egypt, across the Sinai Peninsula to the Egyptian main Egyptian cities. This pipeline here was interfered with by sabotage during the Morsi era to the extent that Egyptian gas stopped flowing to Israel. They're now thinking of Israeli gas going the other way to Egypt along the same route. To avoid the danger of sabotage, they'll have to build a new section of pipeline here out to sea. The sabotage was caused by if I was either jihadist types or criminal types of the local Bedouin. As long as it's out to sea, invisible, it's much safer than it would be on the land. There are a couple of other options which are being considered as well, but this puts it into a regional context. The other is what to do with Aphrodite's gas here, the Cyprus gas. Cyprus is has a smaller population than Israel. It doesn't particularly need gas or the gas infrastructure, which can be so expensive for local generation. So at least commercially, its option is to export all this gas. And these dashed lines are indications of some of the current plans of how they're going to do that. Right, so that's the basic structure of where we are at the moment. I wanted to bring you up to date on the political dimension in Israel, which is the part of I've essentially answered the first part of this question, what should happen? I now want to move on to what could happen. And I have to say that I have been kept very busy for the last year trying to understand and trying to chronicle and trying to advise and come forward with suggestions to help Israel dig itself out of a huge regulatory mess that it's made for itself over what to do with gas. And essentially this started happening at the end of December last year when the Israeli antitrust commissioner declared that a tentative deal he had worked out with Noble Energy, the American company which has discovered all this wealth, this natural gas wealth, and the Israeli partner of Noble, which is called Delek, the potential deal he had worked out with him was no longer applied, and he decided they were a monopoly. I've always found this, at one level you can sort of agree with that, at another level it seems dreadfully unfair. As I said, Noble is the only company which has actually found gas offshore Israel in commercial quantities, and for their success they've now been declared as being a monopoly. But there's a way out of that, which is that they sell off some of their interests in the fields. And there was a deal which had been worked out last year for this, but then at the last moment the antitrust commissioner declared that that deal was no longer applicable. We have then headed into an Israeli general election and government formation, and we have and the whole of the natural gas issue has become highly charged politically. It's a complicated issue, but essentially Noble's Israeli partner is run by a man called Chuba, who runs Delek. And Chuba is a very rich Israeli, and he's an Israeli which many other Israelis love to hate because he's too rich and because he's been too successful, and on the occasions when he hasn't been successful, there's at least a perception, if not a reality, that he's made other people pay for his failures rather than taken the hit himself. This has made life very complicated, and it is only now that the situation is beginning to recover. Leviathan, the big field, should have become, work should have become, started on it to make it operational earlier this year, and original plans for its operational status were sometime next year. Everything has been put on hold, and now, even if everything went smoothly from this point on, Noble wouldn't be in a position to make a positive decision to go forward on all the investment necessary to develop Leviathan for at least another 12 months. And this is all the investment necessary. I've tried not to use many figures, but the amount of investment to develop the Leviathan field is $6 billion. And that has to be raised by Noble, it has to be raised by Delek, and you have to raise that money. It's not as if they can go to the Israeli exchequer and say, give us $6 billion. They have to raise that money for themselves by selling off some of their assets, going for loans and things like this. And you can't go for loans unless you, nobody's going to lend you money on this unless they think there's it's a viable business proposition. And there's still a question mark over the business proposition aspect of this because of the political and regulatory uncertainty in Israel. Now, I am well aware that you could make I'm not going to have the vote here, but people in Israel, people in the rest of the world have views on Bibi Netanyahu. And they tend to be very clear views. Nobody is, I don't know, on Bibi Netanyahu. And it's, in American terms, he has a lot of negatives. That may or may not be the case. On natural gas, though, to my mind, Bibi is right. He has a very good sense of the challenge of this, the importance of this, and his determination to push through against political opposition, even amongst his allies and in his own cabinet, and certainly against other people. He sees this development of natural gas as being a key component for Israel's future. He gets it, and put all the other issues that you may disagree with him with to one side. I think he should be applauded for his determination to develop natural gas. At a local level, I hesitate to since I'm not an Israeli, I hesitate, and there are Israelis in the room, I hesitate to describe their political beliefs because they can do it much better than I. But in simple terms, the arguments against natural gas in Israel are that some people are going to make too much money out of this. Well, commercial companies, when they invest and when they're successful, they make money. Governments, when they allow the exploitation of the nation's wealth, take revenue from it. So the Israeli government is going to take its slice of the action on this. Part of the argument in Israel comes down to the price will be too high. Well, my next slide, or at least I hope it's my next slide, this becomes very, you don't need to take this in a manner which you try to understand it too much. But essentially, the price that Israelis pay or have paid, this is a chart which is valid to the beginning of this year, is being depicted, the price they pay is depicted by the yellow line, which ends up there. And the price, this is the chart for prices. These are, and I did promise you that it wouldn't get complicated, but gas, the price of gas is dollars per billion British thermal units. Having got that complicated, I'll now retreat from that. But essentially, you can see that the, if I can see, yeah, I mean, it's roughly $6, just below $6 for what the Israelis have been paying for their gas. The green line is what the wholesale price of American gas, which is slightly cheaper. But you could say there that American gas is plentiful and doesn't come from 6,000 feet below the ocean somewhere. So there's some inherent costs in producing Israeli gas. And meanwhile, the blue line is the European price, and the red line is the Japanese LNG price. There has been an argument in Israel that even the yellow line is too high. Israelis should only be paying what Americans pay for natural gas. This is, of course, nonsense, but it does give you an indication of the absurdity of the debate which is going on in Israel, and a debate which I hope will be resolved. So I will draw my this part of it to my presentation to an end by just noting the various things which have gone right, which is there is a lot of gas out there, and there are at least tentative arrangements to export it to Jordan and to Egypt. I mean, these are letters of intent, which means you've still got to go and do the actual negotiation. And it has actually changed Israel's relationships with countries in the region. Egypt sees it as a natural economic partner. The average Jordanian probably doesn't want to buy gas from Israel, but I think the view of the King of Jordan is is something along the lines, it's not what Jordan wants, it's what Jordan needs in terms of gas. It's also meant that Israel has worked closely with Cyprus. Cyprus used to be hostile, not in a military sense, but certainly a diplomatic sense towards Israel. It is now one of Israel's closest regional buddies. And as I said, it's also had improved relations with Egypt. One of the casualties of this has been that Israel's relations with Turkey have got worse, but the Turks seem to be driving their own way forward on making bad relations with Israel, so you can't contort yourself too much about what the Turks think at this stage. I haven't mentioned the Palestinians. The Palestinians' economy, and Khalil Shakaki has now gone, and he might not like this description, but the Palestinian economy is a subset of the Israeli economy, and it might want to be independent, but it can't be independent. They have to work together on this one. And the Palestinians themselves need want to generate their own electricity, but they will always, at least at this stage, it's hard to see that they'll ever be, they can do this independently. They might have their own power stations, but the only viable way forward is for both Israel and the Palestinians to mix their electricity. The Palestinians also have a natural gas field, which is offshore Gaza, called Gaza Marine. It is undeveloped, but and it's not huge, but it's sufficiently large to be interesting to develop commercially. The Palestinians would need to invest to develop it commercially and need to agree with Israel on the development of it. Abu Mazen in Ramallah has hesitated to do this. One can only guess why he's hesitated, but essentially I think the answer is he doesn't want to do anything which will boost the fortunes of his rivals, the Hamas authorities in Gaza. Now, the things which are going wrong, as I said, this argument over the monopoly issue, the delays, there's also an outside factor which cannot be ignored, which is, as you well know, the price of oil has fallen hugely in the last 18 months, and a consequence of that has been the prices for natural gas have also fallen as well. This makes the viability of these projects questionable if even in the best circumstances, in circumstances whereby there is political opposition and regulatory delay, Noble is a commercial company. It is owned by its shareholders. Its shareholders might decide that investing in Israeli offshore gas isn't the project that they were looking for. They could stop. They could sell it off if they could find a buyer. They could also, and this is not beyond the stretch of imagination, but would be a horrendous thing to happen, they could decide that Israel hasn't done its part in the agreements between Noble and Israel on allowing the development of the gas fields, and it could take, Noble could take Israel to commercial arbitration. In such circumstances, there is is it a good chance or a bad chance? It depends which side you're looking at this from. From Noble's point of view, there's a good chance if it went to commercial arbitration, it would win, and Israel would have to fork out billions of dollars in compensation to Noble. So that is a real challenge moving forward. And it shouldn't happen, and it needn't happen. One last thought is I've managed to describe all this without talking about the complete chaos going on in the Middle East, in Syria and Lebanon in particular. Lebanon on this borders Israel, Syria borders Israel. There's a danger of contamination, and Lebanon's a curious state, which is never as stable as it should be, but never as unstable as it would otherwise appear that it should be. But Israel can't deal with Lebanon on this issue at this stage until, frankly, there's a result in Syria. I think we would all hesitate to predict what the end game will be in Syria and when that might happen. I will stop here. I'll end by just showing my final slide. That's to do with, is there a market out there? And the answer is there is a market out there, but we can go into that as necessary. This is a slide I took myself in May. I was in Jordan, and I took a road trip down to the southern end of the Dead Sea in order to see the industrial facilities which are going to make use of Israeli gas. And this is a sign for the bromine company plant, and that's the plant behind it. An interesting aspect of this plant and the potash plant, which is a few miles further down the road, is that although they've got Jordan in the title, they're in fact owned by a consortium of Jordanian government and semi-government bodies and other Arab countries and semi-government bodies, including Saudi and Kuwaiti shareholders. This 10 years ago would have meant that there would be no such thing as a deal for these companies to take Israeli gas in order to generate electricity. For some reason, and I think this is an optimistic note, these countries have decided not to make a fuss about the decision of these industrial plants to take Israeli gas. And that, I think, is a reason for optimism. Thank you.